You fired the janitor for helping a kid? Shame on you. Ben Carter simply talked to a crying student. That conversation cost him his job, but within 24 hours, the school was at the center of a media firestorm, students rallied in protest, and a call from the governor's office changed everything. You won't believe what happened next. Benny Carter wasn't the type to complain. He never had been. Complaints didn't pay the bills, and they sure as hell didn't make a janitor's mop any lighter. He'd been scrubbing the same hallways for years in that little Ohio middle school, pushing his cart down the linoleum floors while kids rushed past, barely noticing him. To them, he was just the janitor, the guy who unclogged toilets, scraped gum off desks, and smelled like industrial cleaner. Teachers weren't much better. They treated him like background noise, like part of the furniture. Necessary, but not worth a second glance. Whatever. It didn't bother him. He wasn't in this job for recognition. He just wanted his paycheck, a little stability, and maybe, just maybe, to make sure the school didn't turn into a complete disaster zone. But that night was different. Benny was making his rounds, mop in hand, when he heard it, soft, muffled sniffling. At first, he ignored it. Kids cried all the time, usually over stupid stuff, bad grades, friend drama, cafeteria pizza being a disappointment yet again. But this was different. This wasn't the whiny, attention-seeking kind of crying. This was the kind that came from somewhere deep, from a place that had been hurting for a long time. He followed the sound, rounding the corner by the lockers, and there, curled up like he was trying to disappear into himself, sat a kid, a scrawny 8th grader with wild red hair and tear-streaked cheeks. Evan Hall. Benny knew the kid, at least by sight. He was the quiet type, always sitting alone at lunch, always keeping his head down. The kind of kid that got overlooked, same way Benny did. Benny leaned on his mop and sighed. "All right, kid, spill it. What's going on?" At first, nothing. Just silence, except for the occasional shaky breath. But then, after what felt like forever, the kid spoke. "Mom left. Dad drinks. Nobody cares." His voice cracked on the last part, and just like that, Benny understood. He wasn't a teacher. He wasn't a counselor. He sure as hell wasn't some wise old mentor with all the answers. But he knew what it was like to feel invisible, to feel like you could disappear and nobody would notice. He crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. "Yeah, well, I see you, kid, and I know you're stronger than you think." Evan didn't respond right away. He just wiped his nose on his sleeve, staring at the floor like it might swallow him whole. They sat there for a few minutes, no deep speeches, no dramatic moments, just silence. And sometimes that was enough. Eventually, Evan sniffed, nodded, and got up. He didn't say thanks. He didn't have to. He just walked off, shoulders a little less slumped than before. Benny didn't think much of it. Just another moment in another long shift. And then, the next day, he got called into the principal's office. Benny stepped into the principal's office, already sensing trouble. The air in that room always smelled like bad coffee and disinfectant, a place where decisions were made by people who never actually stepped foot in a real classroom unless it was for a photo op. Behind the oversized desk sat Principal Holloway, a man who had mastered the art of looking concerned while doing absolutely nothing. But it wasn't him that worried Benny. No, the real problem was Mrs. Graves, a woman whose entire personality revolved around rules, policies, and making sure no one in the school ever did anything that wasn't written in an official handbook. She was the kind of woman who spoke in clipped, rehearsed sentences and adjusted her pearl necklace every time someone questioned her authority. Mid-50s, perfectly ironed blouse, and the unmistakable aura of someone who thought they ran the world. Benny had barely taken a seat when she folded her hands neatly on the desk and hit him with it. "Mr. Carter, we have a problem." Benny frowned. A problem? He had spent the entire morning scraping gum off desks and unclogging the boys' restroom, which, spoiler alert, was always the real problem. Mrs. Graves exhaled like this conversation was already exhausting her. "We received a complaint that you engaged in an inappropriate conversation with a student." Benny blinked. "Inappropriate? What are you talking about? I spoke to a kid who was crying in the hallway." "Tom, that's not your job, Mr. Carter." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. You are a janitor, not a teacher, not a counselor. Benny felt his jaw tighten. So what was I supposed to do? Walk past him, pretend I didn't see? You should have reported it to the proper channels. She leaned back in her chair, expression unreadable. Now, the students' parents are concerned. They feel uncomfortable with an unsupervised conversation between their child and a school employee who is not authorized for such interactions. Benny's fingers curled into fists. Concerned? About what? That someone actually gave a damn? That a kid who had been sitting there alone, hurting, had been treated like a person instead of a problem to file away in some database? Are you firing me for talking to a student who needed help? His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Mrs. Graves didn't answer right away. She just straightened the stack of papers in front of her, her carefully manicured nails tapping against the desk. The school board will be reviewing the situation. Translation: they already made their decision. He was done. Benny wanted to laugh. He wanted to throw his hands up and ask if they even heard how ridiculous they sounded, but he didn't, because he knew how this worked. He wasn't a teacher, he wasn't a counselor, he wasn't anyone they'd bother standing up for. He was just a janitor, and in their world, janitors didn't get second chances. The next morning, Benny walked into the school one last time. He wasn't wearing his uniform, no gloves, no janitor's belt, no keys jangling at his hip, just jeans, a flannel shirt, and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder to collect whatever scraps of his dignity he had left in that tiny supply closet they called a janitor's office. The hallways felt different today. Teachers whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting away the moment he passed. Students stared at him, not with the usual indifference, but with something else, something like unease, like they knew they were watching a man walking to his own execution. So this is what it felt like to be a ghost before you were even gone. Benny kept his head up, kept his pace steady, but the weight in his chest got heavier with every step. It didn't matter. He was done here. But then he saw it. A sheet of paper taped right in the middle of the hallway bulletin board. At first, he barely glanced at it. Probably another announcement about the bake sale nobody actually wanted to go to. But something about the way people were clustered around it, whispering, made him pause. His name was on it. Benny's brows pulled together as he stepped closer. The handwriting was shaky, like whoever wrote it had been nervous. He started reading. He was the only one who saw me. He didn't walk past. He didn't pretend I wasn't there. He told me I wasn't alone. He saved me. Evan Hall. Benny exhaled sharply. His stomach tightened. But that wasn't all. Beneath Evan's name were dozens of signatures. Students. Some he recognized. Kids he had nodded to in the hallways. Kids he had helped pick up their spilled notebooks. Kids he had never even spoken to, but who, apparently, had noticed him more than he thought. And they were all saying the same thing. "They can't fire you, Mr. Carter." The voice came from his left, and he turned to see a girl from 10th grade, Amy something. She was standing with a group of students, arms crossed, eyes blazing. "We're not going to let them." Benny opened his mouth to say something. He wasn't even sure what. But before he could, the office phone rang. Loud, shrill. From the way Principal Holloway bolted out of his office to grab it, Benny could tell it wasn't a routine call. The principal's face went pale as he listened, nodding quickly, his posture stiff. Then, with a tight, almost panicked glance in Benny's direction, he hurried back inside and slammed the door shut. The students were still watching. Waiting. Benny had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over yet. The story blew up. News crews, headlines, outrage, the school board drowning. Next thing Benny knew, he was back in the principal's office. But this time, he wasn't the one in trouble. Mrs. Graves looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. We want to apologize, Mr. Carter." Benny crossed his arms. Too late. Because by then, he already had a new job offer, helping students, officially. Oh, and a paid path to becoming a social worker. A few days later, he walked back into the school, not as a janitor, not as a nobody. Students cheered, teachers clapped, someone held a sign, "Welcome back, Mr. Carter." He didn't smile for the press. He smiled for Evan, because in the end, he didn't just save a kid that night. He changed everything.